Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Sullivan. I am co-founder at House of Complexity, and today I'm coming to you on Gadigal land of Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For those of you that may be new to us, we are a design studio, a institute, and a ventures practice, and we're very interested in developing transdisciplinary practices for complex situation. And a part of that is a belief that no single perspective is sufficient, which is why we're very interested in talking to people from lots of different perspectives and lots of different practices. And I couldn't be more happier to have the two people we have joining us today, Iain Kerr and Jason Frasca from Emergent Futures Labs. I've had the great pleasure in learning from their practices and their knowledge for must be a good few years now, it feels like. And really, there's two key questions that sit at the heart of their practice. So what is creativity? And how do we innovate? And today's conversation around a very perhaps theoretical and philosophical and yet deeply practical idea, and that is world making. So just by way of introduction, Iain is a designer. He works at the intersection of creativity, ecology, and emergent systems. And Jason brings about 3 decades of experience working across business, technology, startups, teaching, and making centered innovation. So they both co-direct the MIX, or I'm not sure if you say the Mix Labs, at Montclair State University, and founded Emergent Futures Labs in 2018. And I genuinely could not recommend their work enough. They have an amazing newsletter that's illustrated, a podcast. They've got a glossary, an amazing bibliography that I've found my way to many of their recommendations, and a world makers platform as well. So I'm sure today will be just a bit of a taste for you, but I do encourage everyone to venture over to their website, have a look and get involved. Just once again, a massive thank you for you all being here, and of course for you too, Iain and Jason. Over to you both. The way we'll probably run things, I'm guessing, let us know if you want to stop for questions or if you want to have questions at the end. And yeah, we can run in a flexible way.
Yeah, I think we were hoping questions in the chat maybe to start, and then we can address them as we go / at the end, any unresolved ones, if that's okay. And then I would say, Stephen, thank you for that amazing introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. We're honored to have the opportunity just to talk about creativity and innovation. We love the topic, and to talk about it among those that are also interested and curious around creativity and world making, and moving beyond problem solving and solution thinking is very exciting for us. So thank you for that. Before I start, just want to make sure you can see my screen, my presentation. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we could start with a simple and maybe obvious question. What is creativity? What image do you conjure in your mind when you think of creativity in action? What's coming to mind at the moment? I suspect most answers include a series of unspoken assumptions. When we imagine the scene of creativity in action, we see a human, a solitary individual, and a genius even. So someone having a great idea, right? It could be in the shower, my best ideas, taking a walk, or perhaps a road trip, lost in the desert high on peyote, right? The picture is always the same. A single mind producing a novel idea, and then much later, with great difficulty, figuring out how to make it real. Unfortunately, that picture is wrong. It's wrong broadly speaking, and it's wrong in every detail. So today, what Iain and I would like to do is pull that picture apart slowly, carefully, and replace it with something far more interesting and more useful. So just going back to that, the question that drives all of our work, which is, what is creativity? Well, creativity is the processes by which something new and different comes into being. That's it. It's not a human trait. It's not a talent. It's not a thing somewhere in someone. Creativity is processes. And processes don't live exclusively in people. They live in the ongoing activity of reality itself. The Big Bang is the outcome of creative processes. So is the formation of the solar system, our home planet here, water, life, plate tectonics, and a whole lot more. So we need to stop treating creativity as something that gets added to the world, like a spice added by a very special chef, and start seeing creativity as what the world is already doing all the time. All the time. Creativity is not just about the things that visibly change. It's about everything. It's everywhere and everywhere ongoing, including all the things that seem to stay exactly the same. Because staying the same is also creative processes. If we just think about what it takes to keep things stable, like a chair staying a chair, or a species persisting, a culture maintaining its patterns, or a business's day-to-day activities. We tend to look at stability and think nothing creative is happening, but the reality is maintaining any form of ongoingness in a complex world is an extraordinary creative achievement. It requires a continuous work of many distributed and ongoing feedback processes, which means creativity is not the exception. It's not reserved for the breakthrough, the inspiration, the great work. Creative processes are found literally everywhere, from seeming sameness on one hand to the emergence of the radically new on the other. And we like to say creativity is worldly, from the formation of stars to political systems to the way language shifts across generations, and everything is of creative processes. There's no opposite to creativity. There are no non-creative activities. The only question, which creative processes are coming to the fore right now. It's the only question we're really wrestling with. And so at this point, we could be clear, very clear about that creativity is not a human, individual, internal property or capacity. This is a recent, these concepts are recent, culturally specific, persistent errors that we need to overcome. The question of creativity is, how exactly does anything come about, persist, and change? And this is where we need to go next and examine how change happens through emergence. Now, to say that everything is dynamic and changing does not mean that everything is chaos. It doesn't mean that there are no stable forms, no patterns, no structure. We're not living in some unformed soup, right? There's through mainly self-organizing processes, stable dynamic patterns are continuously emerging at different scales everywhere we look. A living cell, a weather system, a set of social norms. None of these are fixed, permanent things. They are also not nothing. This brings us to the question at the center of all of this. How does change actually happen? Something genuinely new come about? Well, this is a causal question. What causes this or that to come into existence? And so for a long time, a very long time in the Western tradition, causal explanations have been organized around direct input to output. This causes that models. And these work via three processes: reduction, essentialism, and linearity, where the formula has been remove the superficial and dig deep, layer by layer, to find the essence, and then trace out how this essence causes or is expressed in what is visible. And at its simplest, it is this causes that, where the cause is the essence of a thing that drives its visible expression, and everything traces back to a single source. And we see this expressed everywhere in the metaphors of icebergs and pyramids and onions and trees and linear systems. In all of these, we're digging, uncovering, hunting, and returning to the source. We're going deeper to get to the singular essence. And we see this pattern everywhere. Take, for example, the great man version of history. Aristotle, Newton, Napoleon, Steve Jobs, right? They're each credited with producing X, Y, or Z from their individual genius. Or there's technological determinism, where this invention changed everything. Or the deeper layer story, Marx arguing the economic base determines everything above it, or the idea that a cultural mindset shapes all behavior, or that genetics is the ultimate explanation of who we are. The problem is that none of this is accurate for complex systems. Sure, if you can artificially isolate the smallest component in a lab, we can find instances of this causes that. Pardon me. And of course, we find it in many simple mechanical systems, but nothing in the wild, in the world, actually exists or works in such a splendid isolation. In the wild, our lived realities, change is not linear. It's not essentialist. It's not reducible. Nowhere do we find things built layer upon layer, advancing in neat progression as the direct expression of some internal essence. What we find instead is something that is far more ecosystemic, ongoing complex processes, loopings upon loopings of highly distributed feedback systems, integrating heterogeneous, multi-scholar processes into relation-dominant networks that are co-creatively working in real time at different time scales, producing outcomes that could not have been predicted directly from the components alone. So this is what we call in the complexity sciences emergence. And an understanding of emergence is critical to engaging with creative processes. So the best first approximation of emergence is to think of it as a process by which the outcome emerges that is different from, and most importantly, irreducible to the component processes that produced it. While the examples are countless, a great one to start with is consciousness, our sense of being alive. A vast ecosystem of processes contributes to it without it being reducible to any one of them. There is no single source, no neat and clear this causes that. So let's look at the process of emergence in a simple form. One, we have diverse processes come together, individuate in tightly interconnected relation-dominant ways that are non-decomposable. And then two, nonlinear feedback loops. The outcome is something that exceeds the component processes. And this is radically different from them and irreducible to them. And then finally, three, and this is where most people stop before reaching, it transforms the component processes. Let's look at the three processes, and starting with the first two, we can see many things come together and produce something that is more than the sum of its parts, something that wasn't predictable from any individual component. What does this mean in regard to how things come about? Well, we should be paying attention to distributed, heterogeneous, relation-dominant networks rather than any form of a single thing. So let's consider consciousness. Where is it? So we like to use an analogy to kind of illuminate this point of finding something. So let me ask you all a question. Where is flight? If I ask you that question, would you say, is it in the wing? Could we find flight in a wing? Well, if we cut the wing open, we will not find flight whatsoever, because flight is not in anything. Flight's a relational and emergent ecosystemic process. The tides and the lunar cycles, the sun and temperature, thermals and winds, we have mountains, we have shores, we have waves, we have feathers and hollow bones, and much more, right? All of these come together to create flight. Flight is not in any one of those components. And so this is already a radically different way to look at things, right? It means we stop looking for the essence and the hidden root cause, the one thing that explains everything else. The answer is not in anything. Flight is not in the wing, it's not in the feathers, it is an emergent property of a whole relational configuration. Consciousness is not in a neuron. The meaning of a sentence is not in a single word. This is what it means to say emergence is bottom up. The many give rise to the one without any pre-given plan, essence, or blueprint. And now comes the part of that most accounts of emergence leave out when describing it. What emerges changes its component processes. Think about what this means for causality. We're used to thinking of cause and effect moving in one direction. This produces that. But even if we accept that many things can come together to produce one emergent thing, the basic logic still feels comfortable. Many causes, one effect. But if what emerges turns around and transforms the components that give rise to it, then the effect is also a cause. The last is also the first, and the outcome is also the origin. It's kind of like the dragon eating its tail. And often this is called top-down emergence, but as Evan Thompson and John Searle note, it's better understood as a system causation. The system as a system has causal effects on each element. Even though the system is made up of those elements, the whole moves at once. You cannot point to one part and say, there is the cause. The emergent outcome is, in Searle's words, present literally at all of the relevant places in the system. If you think of the water in a glass, it is a liquid throughout, not liquid in one molecule and something else in another. The liquidity is a property of the whole, present everywhere at once. And this is in our opinion, the end of the road for simple linear causation in complex contexts, right? To ask which came first, the chicken or the egg, is revealed as besides the point. The purported causes of the last are made by the last. If we consider how often we think of biological and social forces interacting, what is called the nature versus nurture debate, it's often portrayed as a layered system. At the base are physical laws, then genes, then their expression of physical systems, and then social forces sit on top, one layer building on with the previous offered. But this can't be how things work. If what emerges changes its component processes, the social, the lived experience of beings is changing the component processes. We're looping emergent bio-enculturated beings. We're not layered pyramids. Complex systems, which is to say all lived reality is emergent through and through. The relation-dominant assemblages that emerges in a bottom-up fashion as something novel and irreducible to its component processes will transform these component processes. Creativity emerges from the middle, and there is no outside from which a plan is imposed, and no inside from which an essence radiates. All right. I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing me kind of talk. So I'm going to transition to my tag team partner here. Iain, you want to take it from here?
Okay. So I want to just go a little further with this idea of emergence, and all the while keep it connected to rethinking creativity. So what does it mean to say that the system, as a system, has causal effects on each element, right? This system causation is happening, even though the system's made up of those elements. System causality, in the way it's often presented, can seem closer to New Age flights of fancy than being grounded in science. So there's one more thing we need to understand about emergent systems that will make system causality, and I think this is a real core part of understanding creativity, a lot less weird, mysterious, or spooky. When something novel and irreducible emerges from the configuration of a tightly integrated network of components, it emergently creates, stabilizes, and here I think the key thing is it limits what the configuration can now do. So we've got a good Australia example here. Think of the water in a toilet bowl. The water molecules, at first are just randomly moving around. They could potentially go in any direction. But the moment you flush, there's an energy gradient. Gravity's pulling it down. And suddenly all of the water molecules are organized, stabilized, and constrained into a very specific emergent pattern, the swirling whirlpool we all know. But why is this? Like, why wouldn't the water just go straight down? That seems like the logical thing, right? And I think here, because of our habits for singular causality, there's a myth that, well, there must be some reason. Perhaps it's that the Earth is rotating in a certain direction, the Coriolis effect. And so supposedly down in Australia, toilet bowls, the water will flush and spin one direction. Well, in the northern hemisphere, it's flushing and spinning in the opposite direction. Turns out this is totally bogus. There's no truth to any of this, right? But you can see in that, like, we want to have a causal answer, that there's something, the spinning of the Earth that's doing that. But the actual answer is way more interesting and a lot more mundane. And it's that the relations as a whole, if we go to the next slide, Jason, the relations, and I think this is a really important part, as a whole act as a creative, enabling, and constraining configuration that give rise to the novel behavior. So where's the cause? We can pop to the next slide. What causes this pattern? The pattern has no discrete source. It's not hidden in the water molecules or something in the toilet bowl or something in the spinning of the Earth. Rather, it's the relations as a whole that act as the creative, enabling, stabilizing, and limiting configuration that creates the behavior of its components. So, I think as in the slide you see, it's the behavior is not in the parts, but it's also not something other than the parts, right? And I think this is the hard, counterintuitive part to understand. That we're not used to thinking about relations. We're used to thinking about things, and we've got, as Jason was saying, our onions and our pyramids, and it's got to be something. And so I think the concept of an enabling constraint is really important here because it gets us out of this simple causality thinking, and it gives us a way to understand emergence at a much deeper and also much more practical level. So if we want to get specific, let's stick with, well, we're fine on that slide. If we want to get specific, we could say that it's always about novel context relevant aspects of each part of something are being mutually selected by the emerging processes and the relationally determining whole, which determines or limits or constrains the parts from acting in other ways. Thus, by becoming an emergent whole, a component's possibilities are simultaneously created relationally and constrained. It gains capacities it did not have before, which is, say, like if you think about the water, it's gained a synchronous capacity to make a whirlpool. It didn't have that before. It's not in the water. And it loses the possibilities it otherwise would have had, like to go in any direction, let's say. So thus, if you think about like a whirlpoolness, or if you think about human personality, or if you think about organizational behavior, it's not going to be found in any of the parts, but it's also not something in addition to the parts. It's a relational configurational quality. This logic of the creative, enabling, stabilizing, and limiting of an emergent configuration, it's a far better way of understanding causality in complex systems. And I think a far better way of thinking about the space of creativity in general. No thing is directly or linearly causing anything else to happen. It's a relational ecology that's always at work. And I think this concept of a relational ecology now is perhaps the first or second intimation we're giving here of what we mean by world and world making. If where Jason was talking already from the very beginning that creativity is a world equality, it's not in a human, it's not ideational. Now we can see that we're talking about relational ecosystems and their agency. So if you think, why doesn't office culture in a specific context produce most often only a certain limited range of behaviors? It's not because of some source of external control. It's not because of individual instinct, personality types. Rather, it's because of the relational properties that individuals possess in virtue of being emergently integrated into that organization in that context. The emergent whole relationally shapes the space of possibility of the parts. Now, you could think of this if you were thinking in a very top-down way that we're talking about something like determinism. But this is not determinism. It's the ongoing creative work of emergent configurations. What is being configured can be reconfigured. What's been stabilized can be destabilized. But the configuration is creating and stabilizing, constraining, and this is very real. It's just not permanent. This powerful logic of an ecology of relations doesn't stop there. It's also fundamental to all living things and what we see, what we feel, and ultimately what we experience. So another hopefully good Australian example, think of your experience of water. You're standing at the edge of a pool, and if you have the embodied capacities and skills for swimming, you'll jump right in and you'll directly experience water as a liquid supportive environment. It's going to slow down your fall. You'll start to float, and you'll just be there, and you can move, right? And that isn't something subjective. It's not in your head. The water is really affording the slowing down of your dive, and it affords the possibility of floating and swimming. But now consider, if we go to the next slide, water, the very same water from the perspective of a microscopic marine bacteria. Incredibly tiny, right? The smallest living organisms. It will not directly experience the very same water as liquid and all that this might afford. No, it'll experience being bumped around by big molecules, like it's in a kind of ocean of marbles, a world of marbles. So it's the same water. The water hasn't changed. And there's two very real, they're not subjective, and very different experiences. You could say that we share a similar general environment, but live in different worlds. The world of the bacteria is a world where it's bounced around like marbles. And the world of human swimmers is one of liquid that affords floating and slowing down and all of these things. So now let's add one more experience to this. Imagine that you wanted to and you could, and you built this very special diving board that is about 2,000 feet above the water. The exact same water. The water's not changed, right? And you decide to jump off. What the water will afford when you hit it from falling from 2,000 feet, it's not going to be a liquid. It's not going to gradually slow your body down. It will afford the exact same thing as hitting concrete from 2,000 feet. And it's not like you could be on top of that diving board and think, like in your head, well, I know what water is. It's a liquid. It'll slow me down. Nor could you have like some subjective idea of how magical your powers are. That exact same water that was a liquid and was marbles is now a solid. So three very different and very real experiences: liquid, marble, solid. How can this be? Because nothing in the water's changed. It's the same water. So where and this is like Jason's question, where is liquidness or solidness or the bouncing marbleness? Where are they? And this brings us back to our idea of a relational ecology. And if we go to the next slide, we always have to think of this pairing that on one hand, we have an environment. And, and the environment in this case is water. It might be a shaped water, like pool, little chlorine, certain temperature, certain depth. And we have a skilled embodied agent. I think this is really important. Embodied here really matters. It's the type of body we have, the size, the fat content, what have you, that is relating to the salinity of the water. And we're skilled. It's not like it could just be anybody. And they're in relation to each other, right? So the diving human, because of this relation to the environment, there's actual potentials for action emerge, right? The liquidness of water can emerge, the floatingness, the hardness, but not marbles, right? Because that's not a relational possibility. It's because of the configuration and how it's constrained. You can't subjectively decide when you're 2,000 feet above it's going to be liquid or that you could be bounced around by marbles like bacteria. What the water is directly to us is because of the relational configuration. And this is this relational thing, if we go to the next slide, is what really matters. And again, we're coming back to this concept of the relation, but now it matters in a much more direct and immediate way to us. And this is what James Gibson, the founder of ecological psychology, called a relation, an affordance. If we go to the next slide. And I think this is a really important concept, that our direct experience of reality is relational. Like, we experience water as a liquid, and that's a relational experience. We're not experiencing it from nowhere. It's relationally. And that direct experience then is the potentials to act. Like, it's a relational ability to do something with it is what we directly experience. So an affordance is what we directly, non-reflectively experience. And I think this is really important to creativity. It's coming before thinking, before like brainstorming and cognition. It's the directly experienced relation between our skilled bodies, practices, tools, and some context-relevant aspects of the environment that give rise to the potential for action. All living beings are always, at all times, in action. We're always directly engaged. And in this, we directly and immediately pre-consciously experience water, as swimmable if we have the skills. But we all, for example, directly experience the floor as walkable. Like, we're not thinking and looking at it and imagining what is it and testing it out. It shows up as a relational set of affordances, right? So, our legs just step, we just jump in. So differing configurations, and you could also think of these as coalitions. Differing coalitions equal very different realities are emerging and being created. And you could call these, and I think it would be fair to call them worlds. The bacteria is living in one world. We're living in another world. And you could imagine swimmers or divers. There's a certain way you could say they're in a different world than others. So now we can add this to this concept of worlds. And I think we can also, Jason, if we go back one slide, we can also immediately sense that the world isn't just there neutrally. It's something that's being made, right? And I think the making is a really important part. Imagine you're a good swimmer and you're swimming in the ocean, and you see that it also affords diving. So you try to dive, and it's hard work. So you realize the way you swam on the surface won't work. So you're developing new skills. Maybe you're learning how to hold your breath, and then you realize, well, what happens if I change some tools? Like I add a weighted belt. Maybe if I invent flippers, a snorkel, it will afford different things. So you're not passive in this. The world can be expanded, changed, developed. And so it's always this kind of ongoing world making. And not only are you extending yourself, but there's always the construction of the niche itself, the environment. The environment's not just out there. All living beings are co-shaping it, right? So now we can get a deeper intimation of creativity as already a type of world making that's not in our head, that's making, you could say, properties of the world, liquidness, solidness, marble bouncingness, emerge alongside a subject who can engage with it. All right. It seems then that creativity is the emergent outcome of a stable configuration of processes. How should we best understand how we as humans are part of these relational configurations? We find ourselves always already part of a constructed assemblage of processes, the tools, built environments, concepts, regulations, and practices. This is something that Martin Heidegger, the German phenomenologist, said, this is our thrownness. We find ourselves already in these worlds. It's not like you're born and you make it all up from scratch however you want. In this co-constructed ecology of configurations that we find ourselves in is what Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze termed an assemblage. And I think this is something that you discussed earlier a few days ago with Iain Buchanan. So I hope it's familiar to many of you who've participated in that. And if you haven't, I hope there's a way to go back to it because it must have been fascinating and really good. So if all things begin already in and of complex systems, then they begin in and of relation-dominant networks, what we've been talking along all the time. And within and through these, we collectively participate in more than human co-creation of assemblages. This idea we're already seeing with the water example. And here's where essentialism can surreptitiously return as we imagine our relation to assemblages. Isabel Stengers, the philosopher of science, put it this way. She said, I do not exist and then enter into assemblages. And I think this is often how we think of these. Well, there's me, and then, water, diving boards, tools, concepts. She said, rather, the matter of my existence is my very participation in an assemblage. We go to the next slide. So this isn't the image. If we go to the next one, we're not first formed as complete independent individuals who then choose to enter into relationships. The relationships come first. We're constituted by them, or rather we and our environment are co-constituted by them. And I think this is a really important part of an assemblage and emergence, where the emergent outcome, the self and our environment, are co-constituted by them, right? But this is also not something simply happening to us. We're participating in their co-creation. There's no outside, right? Our very existence as the particular beings we are and the environments we have is the result of the assemblages we participate in. If we go to the next slide. An assemblage is not a support network. It's not a helpful context. It is the basic unit of a living being's existence. It is its world. Stengers goes on to say this, and I think this is the really important part. I am not gifted with agency, which would be the classical humanist idea. It's like it's all coming from me, especially in creativity. I'm not gifted with agency, the possessor of intentions and initiative. Animation, agency, intentionality belong to the assemblage as such. Now you must remember that we're co-constituted and co-creating that assemblage. So it's not like it's now happening to us from the outside. The components of an assemblage are always heterogeneous. Different kinds of things, bodies, objects, ideas, environments, practices, histories, tools. They're multi-scalar, operating at different sizes and time scales simultaneously. They're dynamic and changing, and they are non-linear, right? This is an emergent thing. The connections between them loop and feedback in ways that cannot be mapped onto simple chains of cause and effect. What emerges from an assemblage is something that none of its components possess separately, right? It's not in anything. And as we've just seen, what emerges goes on to transform the components. This is this idea of a constraint, enabling constraint. But again, none of this is static or passive. It's a world that's ongoing in the making. And we're an outcome and a participant. And as Jason was saying, it's these strange loops upon loops. And this is where we find ourselves. And it has profound implications for how we understand ourselves, creativity, and agency. We're embedded and extended, bio-enculturated, creative, collective becomings. All activity and all cognition is distributed, right? It's not just bees that have distributed cognition. Our cognition as individuals is equally distributed, groups and organizations equally so. These are all forms of collective agents and minds, distributed in mindings, where the dynamic changing assemblage is achieving the goals. So what is the creativity of the living? It involves experimentally modulating a self plus environment relation such that a field of novel affordances emerges alongside novel practices, skills, concepts, tools, and environments. And this is what I meant by the example of somebody swimming and then learning how to dive, right? It's an expansion of an affordance landscape, and it's an expansion of a world, right? That's co-constituting us in a novel or a differing environment. So this is not a claim that the individual dissolves or doesn't matter. It's a claim that the self and environment continuously co-emerge from an assemblage that differentiates without separation. We're distinct, but not separate. We're different, but intrawoven. We're an emergent outcome and an agent of this mutually co-shaping configuration. So strange emergent loop upon ongoing strange emergent loop of world making. So there's one more part we want to add here. So if everything is of an emergent assemblage, let's wait a sec with that image. We'll just go back. If everything is of an emergent assemblage-based ongoing creative looping process, where the outcome's changing the component processes, then there's no context-free, no really emergent network-free position from which to observe reality neutrally. None of us is floating above reality, watching it from a distance, reporting back. We're inside it. We're of it. Observation then is not a passive act. To look at something is to interact with it. To be present somewhere is to be part of what's happening there. We're always in and of a very active middle. This is more radical than it might first appear, because it means that how we feel, sense, act, conceptualize, and know, all of it has a history. all of it is creatively co-shaped by where and when and with/what we're interwoven. Our most basic experiences of being alive, how we perceive our own bodies, how we understand pain or pleasure, what we might call love, or what we take as the givens of life and direct experience, none of this is universal or timeless. It's all the outcome of a specific history, a specific worlding, specific way of making worlds. Let me give you an example that makes this concrete. The historian Barbara Duden, we can go to that next slide, who was interested in how women historically experienced their bodies, spent years working through the records of an 18th century German doctor who'd seen about 1,700 women patients and recorded, and I think this is the really interesting part, he'd recorded in precise detail how they described what they felt in their bodies. And as she was trying to understand these women's experiences of their bodies in their own terms, she came to the realization that she couldn't build a bridge from her own experience of her body back to theirs. As she put it, she had to learn to recognize that her own perceptions of her body were epoch specific. So epoch specific, not universal. So I would say, and this is something she argues explicitly, that we're talking about assemblages. We're talking about affordances. And what Duden came to realize is that what a German woman, that's her in the 1990s, experiences directly as her body is not how a woman in 1725 experienced hers. And it's not just that medicine or practices or language is different and somehow underlying it is there's something that's the same. The fundamental experience itself is different. The way the body is enacted, felt, moves, communicates, the way sensations are interpreted, what they mean, all of this is shaped by an epoch-specific set of active assemblages. So again, we're talking about creativity here, right? Or a world that's co-produced the person directly having the experience. This applies to all of us. How we experience things directly as things, what strikes us as given, what requires no explanation, how we act, feel, sense, and think. These are not features of an internal, eternal, universal human nature. They're emergent relational features of an epoch-specific set of assemblages. And this is what we should understand, I think now getting to the broadest sense of what it means to have a world. All humans don't share the same worlding or modes of world making. They're in fact distinct. Understanding that we're always of a specific world making, that our most basic way of being embodied, of experiencing, sensing, doing, and knowing are historically and collectively produced, are the bio-enculturated emergent outcome of an epoch-shaping set of dynamic assemblages. And I think here it's important to remember, or it's important to state that this isn't a social constructivist type of argument. It's not an argument that we culturally perceive or see things differently. It's not about wearing a certain type of glasses and you could take off the glasses and you'd see reality for what it is. That again would be to imagine exactly what Isabel Stenger is saying we can't do, like that we're separate from an assemblage and then we enter into it, but we're the outcome of one. I think this is why it's social constructivism fails. This is co-creative. This co-creative action is happening, as John Pertevi says, above, below, and alongside the subject. Changes to our neurophysiology are happening, as well as changes geopolitically, as well as social technically. And these are all co-shaping us from the level of genetic expression to collective behaviors to environments. And this really should change everything about how we engage with creativity. our sense of ourselves, our world, and all forms of change. But how should we conceptualize this, what Barbara Duden's talking about, like an epoch specificness? Will the term assemblage be sufficient? And I think here the answer is has to be no, because we always find ourselves in more than just one assemblage. We're always of multiple partially coordinated assemblages simultaneously. And these different open mutable assemblages interact, they're changing each other, they're shifting. Some are coming to dominate and entrain others. And from these interactions, the complex historical patterns of who we are and how we experience co-emerge. So if we go to the next slide, Jason. The philosopher Michel Foucault used the term dispositif, or apparatus in English, to get at this, and to describe what happens when multiple assemblages become entrained towards the productive formation of an epoch co-creating worlding. Foucault described a dispositif as a, quote, thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, on and on and on and on. Oh my God. And I think the important part is we can now see from our diving and water example of how we've added a belt and a snorkel and flippers, but we live and we're thrown into this multiplicity of coordinated assemblages, right? There's architectural forms, institutions, regulatory decisions. And these aren't something outside of us, I think is the important thing to realize. But this is who we are, and we're in and of this kind of emergent set of things. What Foucault noticed as a philosophical historian was that when certain configurations of these heterogeneous elements developed together in a region and period, a specific semi-stable way of being alive emerged with them. A particular kind of self, a particular set of modes of actions, particular ways of knowing, environments, tools, habits, and affordances. This is what Duden encountered with the 18th century women patients. Their experience of their own bodies was not simply different from hers. This was the product of a different apparatus, a different dispositif, a different productive configuration of relations, a different world. And I think here it's interesting to look ahead to your next guest, Kees, who talks quite a bit about switching frameworks. And I think there's a strong link here between how he's talking about a framework and how we can see something like a dispositif, shaping in an emergent way how we see, feel, and think. And a framework is like a shorthand way of understanding, the outcome of that. And I think it's important to always connect like that sense, like we can abstract out from it, this is who we are, back to the processes, this coordination of assemblages. Because the creativity doesn't happen at the level of debating the framework or the ideas or the concept, but changing configurations. And this is, I think, where the real play is, and that it changes both us and our environment in doing that. So I think there's something really interesting, Stephen, that you're doing, both with having Iain Buchanan on assemblages, us and world making, and then Kees coming in talking about frameworks. So just kind of pointing in those directions as we come towards our conclusion here, right? Today, as we understand these loopings of bioenculturations, of how bodily environmentally practices shift gene expression, for example, we can see that this is what we're talking about. These complex systems are affecting everything. The apparatus is productive, creative in the deepest sense. And I just want to note here, like how far we've moved from the modern Western definition of creativity as something human and individual and inside, to now talking about apparatuses as creative in the deepest sense. It does not merely describe a world already there. It creates the conditions under which a particular way of being alive becomes possible and coherent. We're not given in advance. Who we are is not given in advance. It must be produced. And it's produced through the creative emergent work of apparatuses, of those larger semi-stable configurations of assemblages that shape our most basic experience of being alive. This loops all the way back to the beginning of the talk. What form do creative processes take? This is always the question, and the answer has to be something like world making. And so now, just quickly, we can return to where we started. If creativity is everywhere and always ongoing, if there's no view from outside, if all creative processes are situated, then what does it mean for us to be of a relationally emergent context? The answer, which we've been building towards for this lecture, is that the question, it's a question of how we are in and of an ongoing creative world in the making, this coordinated set of assemblages. We call this worlding or world making. And I think hopefully these concepts here of emergence, of system creativity, of relationality, of assemblages, of affordances, of enabling and constraining configurations, as well as an apparatus, all give us a sense of that we're of a world, and that there are many worlds, and that other worlds are possible, and that creativity involves experimenting across all three of those. Okay. So that's it for us talking, and it would be great to just move into discussion and, playing around with these concepts and experimenting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Iain and Jason. Definitely invite anyone, if you'd like to either open your camera up and unmute, feel free to jump in if you have any questions, or feel free to just send any questions via chat if you prefer. Jason and Iain, maybe while we give people some time to reflect, I'm curious, have you read The Body Multiple by Anne-Marie Moll? Have you come across her work before?
I have not. This sounds really intriguing.
Yeah, so she develops what she calls ontological multiplicity by taking a practice-based approach to look at how is I think the disease is multiple sclerosis, or I did not pronounce that right, but and she looks
multiple
at
sclerosis.
Yes, that is it. And she spends time in this hospital, and she has this amazing encapsulation that the body is more than one, less than many. And what she looks at, and she asks the question, how is it done in practice? And she says, the body is not, and this disease, sorry, I should say, is not one thing, and with different people bring different perspectives, that they actually enact different realities. So, someone might be cutting into a vein, someone might be looking at population data, someone might be looking at lifestyle factors and the emotional or phenomenological experience of this thing. And they therefore create different objects of reality, and therefore they enact a different reality. And she ask the question, well, how do they hang together there, and recognizes that the acts of coordination become very interesting, and that so therefore we have in this particular instance, one disease, and this is where things get very tricky because we're using the same word. And in the same case, we will, I think, all experience this in organizations where we have a great meeting. It feels like we're all aligned and we're all making sense. And yet people fundamentally have a whole different set of meaning interpretations that sometimes they complement, sometimes they conflict, or sometimes they don't even line up, which I also think is interesting because it goes against the idea that this is all about integration and that good practices just bring stuff together. Whereas she also recognizes the way things sometimes coexist doesn't mean fusing and bringing them together. Sometimes they might run in parallel. Sometimes they may cross. And I think there's some friends of mine that have even played with lines, almost in the same way as Tim Ingold talks about lines as opposed to, or meshwork as opposed to a network. That we don't have objects anyway, and they use that as a visual way to represent. But it's just a really great piece of work that brings it down into everyday practice and just shows you how, yeah, it's not just different perspectives, but there's genuinely different realities co-created and enacted.
Yeah, that's nice. We like to, like the water example is a great one where where you could multiply, say, the creatures, the practices, and then on a human level too, where an animist community maybe sees the water as a human, the body of water as a human. And I think the really important part is to give agency to the configuration in all these cases. That because otherwise we fall back into just mere social construction. Like we just see things differently. And I think this is the important part of like the affordance part of this, is that because of the relational configuration, we have a different world, and this is the example, if you're 2,000 feet above the water, if it doesn't matter what you think the water is, it's going to act like a solid. And that's not a property in the water, but it's a relational property of the configuration. So you could say the agency is in that relational configuration, and you're figuring out how to work with it. And so I think there's an experimental part to this, and I think that's the pragmatism. And I think this is where, in your example, say, of organizations where people leave a meeting with very different things, it's part of the problem that, where you don't have a shared, deeply looped practice, like with feedback loops. You could imagine, for example, skateboarding, where you're all at a skateboard park and somebody's figured out, say, for the first time, you could do something, or you could use something a certain way that there's a relevant aspect of the environment to do this. It becomes, it's not shared merely through discussion, like this means that now. There's a concept emerging maybe of how you do something, but it's enacted. It's the community is enacting that and understanding it through an embodied action. Like, oh, this is what the edge of a planter means, and what we can do with it. And I think that's the important part that's often lacking, in a lot of contexts, is we don't have a way of experientially co-developing things.
Yeah, I think she draws a little bit on actor network theory and really gets into how the specific tools they're using come together. Yeah, I can see there's a couple questions in the chat as well. Katie,
Thanks.
did you want to jump off mute and ask your question? Is Katie still with us?
Yeah, hi, sorry, I was not on the screen to be able to press the mute button. So, hello, lovely to hear all this. It's like quite late now where I am. I'm in the UK. Anyway, so I got two questions. Oh, can you hear me? All right.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
just checking. Okay, I got two questions. Well, not two questions, like I put two things back. So thank
Mhm.
you, first of all. So quantum mechanics is emerging as a popular culture, in my opinion. Do you think that it is a collective consciousness in a transdisciplinary capacity, that quantum mechanics is becoming a popular culture kind of zeitgeist? And then I also added, how do you see cybernetics evolving in all of this? Because you talk about feedback loops quite consistently.
Interesting. Yeah, like I think you could say like analogies become tools that afford certain things. So as a culture takes and stabilizes some kind of quantum analogies like Schrodinger's cat, or the indecidability of something, wave versus particle, non-Newtonian, whatever it might be. Um, it shifts the the conceptual affordance landscape. But it's it's always messy because those things, there's many of these things, right? So like I was mentioning, say, there's more animist concepts, say, coming in, and there might be other types of concepts. I think the important thing is to see all of these as a question of what do they afford relationally, right? Like whatever they might be, if they're from quantum mechanics. And the important thing is, we always like to focus on, and this is very Deleuzian or Spinozian thing, is like, what can something do, not what is it. So it's not really about what is the exact meaning of something in quantum mechanics, but what's it doing? What new affordances does it open up? What relations is it put into, right? So I think, that's probably a very general answer, but for us, from a kind of perspective of creativity, it's always looking at it that way, I think. The second one, cybernetics, I think the complexity sciences is, you could say, that historical outgrowth of the different ways of part of the historical outgrowth of different waves of the cybernetic revolutions, understanding feedbacks, the agency of complex systems, what have you. And so our work definitely draws on all of that in different ways.
Oh, that's great,
I'm
thanks.
yeah.
I am a contemporary visual artist, so I'm not coming
Nice.
from a science background. However, I'm in deep research about the transdisciplinary aspect of creativity and worlds building at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, that's great to hear. I'd say, like, as a visual artist, like, art often gets into this loop of hyper individualism, ideation, expression, and it's a really interesting place to do other things, like, what
Yeah,
happens
My practice is
relational.
within I'm in an artist residency at the moment with 9 other artists, and we are communicating continuously. We all come from very different backgrounds. And also I am facilitating workshops that are very participatory across sectors, intergenerational, lots of different things. So yeah, what you're saying is very much where I'm at in my practice. And I think there's a lot of people in the UK in this sort of mindset that I'm in. So I'm really hoping to be able to play this back. Actually, this recording would be
Nice.
great to be able to play back to my peers, because it's great to hear from the other side of the world. What's your opinion? Thank you.
Nice. Could you share, Katie, in maybe if you're willing, in the notes, the residency, or maybe where people could
Yep,
see some of
I
your
can
work?
send
That would be very
I'll
cool.
type the website for
Cool.
the
Hey, thanks so much.
so it's an art museum where we're based. So I'll send you the email address, website, sorry. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Vanessa, did you want to share your question?
Yeah, hi. And I'll turn my camera on because it feels a bit anonymous, doesn't it? Thank you for an incredibly interesting presentation. It's got me thinking a lot. I'm actually calling in from a place practitioners conference up in Brisbane, so that's in my mind very much. And I think we've part of the discussion, I just wanted to note as well that taking a country first from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and using local language is really reshaping the practice very much. It's been an incredible discussion to have. I think we, as place practitioners, working with complexity, but we may not describe it in that similar way, but working with communities so they can define the problem and then set the scope for what the solutions may be going forward. And my question really is, what struck me being here, and when you noted about how the architecture and policies kind of shape that relation, is the impact of when you're working in a community that has been quite stable in terms of all of those forms versus working in an inner city, which has highly quickly evolving, big churning community, and what that impact may be through your perspective.
Interesting. Well, first I'd say it's wonderful to have a place-based practitioner in and that you're at a conference and thinking about these things, because I hope you sense that this whole model is a type of you're of a place. You're co-emerging with an environment. Deleuze and Guattari late in their work say that their work is a geophilosophy, and I think there's a kind of geo-creativity, emergent, like these ecosystemic approaches are very much about how self and place co-emerge, right? Super fascinating. I don't know well, Australian First Nations practices, and how people are working with them and of them, but from a Canadian perspective, the similar things are happening where we're trying to move, and I think a deeper sense of decolonizing the tools, techniques, practices, and the concept here of that other worlds exist, I think, is an important one when we're thinking of that, and that other worlds are possible. So it would also be very interesting to know, maybe if you want to share a link to the conference. Would be super curious about what you're all doing.
Very, very happy to.
Yeah. The one thing I'd say that I find super interesting, coming from my limited understanding of Australian practices, with ideas of land, is how we get outside of the Western concept of nature, like as this thing that doesn't include humans. And we see like the long history of mutual co-shaping, you know, how we've shaped the landscape, how it's shaped us, and how that is a longer process than even the existence of humans. It, you know, it goes to our pre-human ancestors. So there's a lot of super interesting stuff there.
And I guess it would be interesting if you had any kind of insights, or if there's something further you could direct me to around. There are we have a lot of people from rural and regional areas where I guess the built form, the systems have been quite stable. And then we've got people from inner cities where there's big churn and change.
Yeah. That's a good question. Offhand, I have very little to add.
Oh, no problem.
You know, I think you can find, Stephen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, if I'm understanding Vanessa, I wonder if you may riff on, from a Deleuzian perspective, the notion of territories and processes of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And from what I'm understanding, Vanessa, we have different contexts where there's different degrees of disruption and versus stability.
Yes.
So how do you attune yourself into one environment that might be have a lot of history that's stratified and rigid, versus another one that feels much more in flux and moving and in processes of deterritorialization?
Put it much better than I did. Thank you. Great.
Yeah, there's I mean, a lot of interesting, you know, Deleuze and geography resources you could look at, you know, for what Stephen's talking about. There's a great, John Protevi writes this great dictionary of Deleuze and geography. The hard part, I'd say, is that often, like when we're talking about a dispositif, like that, how things are stabilized, a lot of things that look like change aren't really as changing as we think. You know, so, you know, living in urban environments versus rural ones, it's hard to know on the surface what, you know, where the level of deterritorialization is happening, or, you know, what amount. And it requires a finer grain of paying attention to practices, you know, and how people are navigating and activating and stabilizing things. So I think that's part of the challenge. And but you know, the ideas like Stephen's bringing up of how something is territorialized, how something might be stratified, and how deterritorialization happens and reterritorialization. These are all like super useful tools in general. They apply to, I'd say, to all forms of creativity involve, you know, deterritorializing and reterritorializing, which is about assemblage, you know, disruption and reforming new ones that give rise to new affordance landscapes and that kind of thing.
Awesome. I think we've got a question here from Chris. I'm not sure if Chris is still with us.
I'm here.
Oh,
Hi,
you are.
I'll spare you the
Excellent.
visual. You may have had a chance to read it already, but just in my experience, in organizations, the corporate world predominantly, whenever I begin to step into the territory of saying, hey, maybe this is a complex challenge, maybe we can't have deterministic outcomes that we can plan for in a sequential, linear way, similar to one of the images you shared earlier.
Mhm.
I am often met with some of those sound bites of, we just need to keep it simple, we need to keep driving harder, faster, forward. The recipient typically glazes over, dismisses it, or suddenly forgets that I'm speaking English and I'm some kind of alien. And I'm also struck by the aversion on their part to even look up the definition of a new word to add to their vocabulary to understand or rethink a challenge or a situation they're in. So I'm just curious, beyond us as willing participants in this lecture who have maybe sought out discussions like these, what has been your experience in introducing these concepts to organizations?
I guess there's two parts, for Jason and I. The first, I'd say it's really helpful to be super empathic. I'm not sure how many of us love, to have everything challenged and have to look up all sorts of new words and be faced with like, oh my God, I have to rethink everything. So the way we really like to start is definitely not the way we're doing today. So I don't think it's helpful to give people lectures or explain things when you're in those situations. It's much more helpful to immerse people in the experience of an emergent creative process, let's say, where, Jason, where you were starting with like, it's not in your head, it's not individual, it's not human. People will disagree with you, so, and then you're just going to have some type of debate. But what happens when you immerse, a key group from an organization, like a network of trust that cuts across the organization, into some highly embodied experience of an emergent creative process? And so we often facilitate workshops this way, and at the end of that part, we'll get people to unpack it in their own terms, and we'll really work that slowly so they're as close to the actual experience as possible. So it's not coming like from the place of theory or the imposition of knowledge or saying you're wrong or having a debate, but it's getting people to have a different type of experience and then helping them conceptualize it in their own way that gets at how things are emergent, distributed. There's agency in the relationships. But this, the challenge is to, in a way, to get in the door too and be able to do these things. But when you can, I think you have actual change happening. And the other part, there has to be some duration to these things. If you just get to show up to do something very quick, it's always hard.
Iain, I think you left off the most magnificent part of that experience that I think relates directly to Chris's question and own experience, which is that even when we shift the approach to an experienced, embodied, workshop that the participants physically experience an emergent process where they share with us that the outcomes of the workshop were void of ideation and individualistic ideas, but the outcomes emerged from the experiment and the doing in the workshop. Chris, even when that all happens and we unpack it and we ask people to reflect and explain the process, they will still revert back to, I had an idea. They will still revert back to what they're comfortable with. And they have a very difficult time seeing that their experience was something other than ideation-based, individualistic. And so I think the last point that Iain was making, I think is critical in that it's the transformation, that seeing, that understanding, that vocabulary that you're describing, that potentiality requires more than one touch point. It requires a slow unfolding.
Thank you. I appreciate the response. And by the way, much better than what Dave Snowden said when I asked him the same question. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think that may be it for the questions in the chat, and it's probably a nice place to say once again a massive thank you to you both. I will once again recommend everybody to go and check out Emergent Futures Lab, sign up to their newsletter at least, join the online community. It's really has been so helpful for me, and so much richness there. Thank you both for your generosity and your time, and I certainly hope down the track we can do something again soon. This was wonderful.
Absolutely. It was really great. It was really wonderful to talk with people. I'm looking forward to digging into the links that were shared. And I think, as Stephen said, please sign up. The newsletter is free. Check out the website. There's lots of resources. We try to be very practical. I know today was more theory dense, as befits this occasion, but we're certainly always thinking, what can this do? How do we do things? How do we make things? And we'd love to be in touch with everybody. And Jason.
Yes, thank you all. The questions were really wonderful. Definitely more interesting than usual, and definitely provoking. We never profess to have the answers. We're trying to figure this out too. And I heard Iain say something today he'd never said before, which was, this framework is a geo-creativity. So I'm looking forward to digging in on that with him, and appreciate all of your provocations. And Stephen, thank you for inviting us and offering the opportunity to explore these concepts further with not only ourselves, but with others in your group. So thank you very much.
No worries, thank you. And for those of you that are interested, we've got Professor Case Dorse on June 24th. It's going to be exploring creating deep change and top-down, bottom-up reframing and infrastructure for innovation as well. So that's very much, I think, will be complementary to some of the conversations we've had today.
Absolutely. People should really attend that. It's going to be awesome, Stephen. It's really great to see all the things that you're doing, and it's so wonderful to be part of it. Thank you so much.